Just about 1 week from Deebo Samuel becoming a Washington Commander officially. So what's next? Well, for starters, another trade could be coming in the next few days. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome inside today's episode of Locked On Commanders. I'm your host, David Harrison, your friend on the ground covering the Washington Commanders, doing so for Sports Illustrated's CommanderGameDay.com, also helping out with WUSA9.com's local coverage of the team. And I'm here with you every Monday through Friday on the Locked On Commanders podcast, daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for coming through today for this episode in which we are going to hear from the guys over at Locked On 49ers about what they say the Washington Commanders are getting in Deebo Samuel. But before we get to that, we got to talk about another potential incoming Commander here before the new league year potentially starts. And we got to talk about the latest on a John Allen trade as we look at what comes next following the agreed-to trade for San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Deebo Samuel. We're going to do all of that and every dayers. Special thank you to you before we get started for coming through every single day. Anybody out there, if you haven't already, please subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you are listening to today's episode. Let's get right into it. We're just about 1 week, right, from Deebo Samuel officially becoming a member of the Washington Commanders. The trade cannot go through, become official until the beginning of the new league year, which is 4 p.m. Eastern time, March 12th. So a little over a week away, depending on when you're watching this, from Deebo Samuel officially becoming a Washington Commander, again, pending a physical as well. He's got to pass the physical first. But assuming none of those things happen, assuming there's no hiccups, this time next week, we will be close to talking about Deebo as an actual Washington Commander. So what's next for the team, right? Obviously, it's a splash move. Depending on who you ask, it's a major move. Some people say it's a bad move. Whatever it is, it's getting a lot of attention, a lot of conversation, right? So what comes next for the Washington Commanders? Well, for starters, another trade could be coming up, and it could be coming up as early as by the time this episode drops, to be kind of honest with you. It could come at any moment is the point of the conversation here. We're talking about defensive tackle Jonathan Allen. Of course, it was reported early in the week at the NFL Scouting Combine that Jonathan Allen and his representatives had come to the Washington Commanders and essentially asked for permission to go find a trade partner. Adam Peters, the general manager of the Commanders, go ahead and granting that request. And ever since then, we've basically all been waiting for when and if the other shoe is going to drop on that potential trade, right? Well, Jeremy Fowler of ESPN reported after the news of the agreement that Deebo Samuel will be coming to the Commanders that Jonathan Allen was a part of those trade conversations. However, the 49ers opted instead to just simply take draft capital instead of taking on Jonathan Allen. So if you want to go 1-for-1 swap here, basically kind of looks like the Commanders were trying to get a 5th round evaluation out of Jonathan Allen from the San Francisco 49ers. More likely than not, the 49ers didn't bite on that because as John Lynch, the general manager of the San Francisco 49ers, put it, there kind of comes a time where you need to put your foot on the pedal, go all in, and there kind of comes a time where you need to reset a little bit. The 49ers appear to be a little bit more in reset mode than they are in foot on the gas mode. We'll talk a little bit more about that here later on in the episode. So it makes sense that if you're a team that's looking to essentially rebuild your franchise, not tear it down to the studs, but at least renovate, right? It's called remodel your franchise. You don't want to bring on a guy who's over 30 years old, nearing, the later stages of his own NFL career. So that being said, I think the biggest thing we can take from it is that Adam Peters is at least going to try to get 5th round value out of Jonathan Allen, right? So Allen wants a new deal. He's older. The new team has to give him the new guarantees. It's going to drive the price down a little bit. I know there's a lot of Commanders fans out there who believe that Allen should fetch, a late 3rd round pick, maybe a 4th round pick. But if you do end up with a 5th round pick or worse, it's going to be because of those reasons, because of age, because of the fact that his new team is going to have to give him new guaranteed money. There's no guaranteed money left on his current deal. So whenever a team trades for a guy that they know they're going to have to give guaranteed money to that he's not already owed, that's going to drive the draft compensation price down just a little bit. So you could end up with a 5th rounder. You could also end up with a 2026 conditional 6th. That is a 6th if certain benchmarks aren't met, or a 5th if certain benchmarks are met. Could even be a conditional 7th. That could become a 6th in 2026 as well. You could also see the Commanders end up releasing Jonathan Allen. If they can't come to a trade agreement with anybody and Jonathan Allen can't effectively go find a team to trade for him, maybe teams interested in him, sure, But if they can't find a team to trade for him, then the Washington Commanders may end up releasing him. Again, none of his money is guaranteed. So as long as they do so before his salary or his roster bonus kicks in, all of that money that he would be, on the books for in 2025 would essentially be freed up cap space, which would almost be enough to pay for Deebo Samuel. So you'd essentially be in the same salary cap situation you were before acquiring Deebo Samuel if you were to release or move on from Jonathan Allen. So it just kind of makes sense. So who are the teams to watch here when we talk about teams potentially trading for John Allen now that the 49ers have kind of balked at doing so? The three teams that seem to come up the most when you talk about a John Allen trade are the Chicago Bears, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Arizona Cardinals. So I went ahead and I reached out to each of those hosts, Lauren Cox of Locked On Bears, Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers, and Alex Clancy of Locked On Cardinals. I just said simply, hey guys, if you were to put on your GM hat, if these teams were to be interested potentially in trading for Jonathan Allen, what do you think, relatively speaking, they might be willing to give? Surprisingly enough, at least to me, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Locked On Steelers host Chris Carter said fourth at best, right? Locked On Cardinals host Alex Clancy also said fourth at best. Locked On Bears host Lauren Cox said fifth rounder, but he also said part of that is because the Bears don't have a fourth rounder. So for those of you who want fourth round value out of John Allen, it certainly seems like that's potentially on the table. However, each of those guys also mentioned, it could be a little bit lower because that new contract situation, injury situation, relatively down year, even for the time that he did play. So a lot of those things come into effect. And if the Commanders can kind of try to formulate some sort of bidding war, then maybe you do get a fourth rounder out of either the Steelers or the Cardinals. And unfortunately for the Bears, if they can get a fourth out of one of those two teams, the Bears are going to be out of luck. And you're most likely looking to send him to the Steelers because then he's out of the conference, not in the NFC, and you're not having to worry about seeing him unless you see him in the Super Bowl, which, that's a good problem to have if you're both in the Super Bowl. Now, with the Chicago Bears, there were rumors last year that Ryan Poles, their general manager, was sniffing around trading for him. Then Lauren Cox of Locked On Bears did express interest to me. We're just kind of talking about on the side at the scouting combine of the Bears potentially having interest in trading for him. The Steelers could use DT help. Obviously, they want to look to go a little bit younger, but if they get a little bit of an older guy as a short-term plug while they shore up the rest of the roster, certainly not a bad way to invest a fourth or a fifth round pick. And then Locked On Cardinals host Alex Clancy simply said it'd be smart for the Cardinals to go after a guy like that. Fox Sports' Carmen Vitale recently threw her support behind John Allen going to the Bears, writing, quote, Dennis Allen comes in running one of the most effective 4-3 systems in the league. And guess what makes life a whole lot easier for the entire defense? A really good 3 technique. Also, in the case of Jonathan Allen, he will already have familiarity with the Bears' best pass rusher, Montez Sweat, who's under contract for another couple of years. Reuniting the pair could bring back the dominating fronts Washington was known for just a few seasons ago. While the Bears need help on both sides of the line, Allen would be a good and creative place to start as they assemble the team under Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen's new vision, end quote. And for those of you who laughed when I read the part about them having a dominant line, remember, it wasn't that long ago, right? 3 years ago where the Washington Commanders defensive front was actually looked at as one of the best ones in the league. So that's kind of the latest on the John Allen trade situation. Nothing, no real flames peaking up, nothing like that, but certainly some smoke around some teams that could have interest in Jonathan Allen's services, and certainly the potential that as we get closer to the new league year, one of these teams kind of, I don't want to say panics, but kind of says, okay, look, we don't want to deal with him on the free agent market, so let's go ahead and float you a fifth to go ahead and get him. And then at the end of the day, the Washington Commanders essentially get that fifth rounder back that they sent to the San Francisco 49ers, and freeing up the money from John Allen's contract basically pays for Deebo Samuel. You essentially get Deebo Samuel for almost a zero-sum proposition there. Now let's talk about Deebo's impact on the wide receiver depth chart, right? Because that's got to be a conversation that we have. The current 2025 Commanders depth chart projection for the receiver position: Terry McLaurin is your number 1, Deebo Samuel your number 2, Luke McCaffrey your third receiver. There are some other receivers on the roster currently, but none of them are guys that you would consider locks to be on the active 2026 or 2025 roster for the Commanders when that time comes. Free agents, however: Noah Brown, De'Ami Brown, Olamide Zaccheaus, Jamison Crowder. That's 4 guys. You've already got 3. That's 7 receivers. Last year, the Washington Commanders carried 6 receivers on their active roster for most of the season. And a lot of times, one of those 6 receivers was actually a game day inactive, usually KJ Osborne. So when you look at that, you basically look at these 4 receivers and say, there's no way all 4 of them are coming back, right? Noah Brown, taller than Deebo, outside guy, compared to a guy like Luke McCaffrey, more of an outside receiver, the second leading wide receiver on the roster last year, despite the fact that he came to the team recovering from an injury, didn't get to play right away. then left the season with a kidney injury, didn't get to finish the season. Again, kidney injury, very much a fluke type injury, allowing some roadway, a little bit of a head start actually recovering for this season if they do bring him back. I'm a big advocate of bringing Noah Brown back. Then you kind of look at De'Ami Brown, Olamide Zaccheaus. So I think Deebo Samuel and Olamide Zaccheaus, very similar type players, but I think Deebo is certainly more dynamic of a player than De'Ami Brown. Brings you, again, more of that outside presence, does have the ability to do some things out of the slot, more of a downfield ability type of guy, just kind of seems to fit what Cliff Kingsbury wants to do more. And the way that he came on in the playoffs, I think it's going to mean a lot to this team. So I think if I'm ranking these guys, De'Ami Brown probably the number 2 candidate to come back, but I also think there's going to be a free agent market for him. He's still very young, and a lot of people saw what he did during the playoffs. So I think he's going to have market, may get priced out of coming back. And then Jamison Crowder, I think, is my number 3 guy, really more so just because of how old he is. But look, you're talking about bringing up like your 4th or 5th receiver, maybe your 5th receiver on the roster, also your punt returner. You know what I mean? So Jamison Crowder certainly fills that role. And like I said, all last year, all he does is catch game-winning touchdowns and third down conversions. You love that in a veteran guy. So wouldn't hate to see those 3 guys come back: Noah Brown, De'Ami Brown, Jamison Crowder. If you do all that, you basically have your 6 receivers. So I don't know if you're going into the draft targeting any receivers or going into the rest of free agency or offseason targeting guys, but it's also a reason to hold off on those deals because there are some names that the Washington Commanders could target still ahead of the new league year and, of course, into the new league year, early days of free agency. We'll talk about that and more coming up on this episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And we're doing that thanks to our friends over at FanDuel. And when the games tip off, the NBA action is just getting started. There's no better place to get in on it than at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in whatever action is going on. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into my favorite way to play, same-game parlays. I love same-game parlays, but I also love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game as exciting as the first or the last. Whether I'm backing my favorite team, the Denver Nuggets, for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, I never feel like I'm missing out on a chance. And since I live here in this area now, obviously Washington Wizards basketball is always of interest for me, even if they're not doing so hot all the time. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you can get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers, you can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Continuing now today's episode of Locked On Commanders, we're looking at what comes next after the Deebo Samuel trade agreement, right? Again, the trade doesn't go final until next week at the start of the new league year, but the agreement is in place. And clearly the way that all parties are talking, the Commanders sending out the Deebo gif on social media, the 49ers kind of openly discussing the decision to move him. And then, of course, Deebo, saying his goodbyes and everything, not really expecting any hitches in that to become official. So that should become official soon. So we talked a little bit about the next trade that the Washington Commanders might make coming out of their roster. Obviously, John Allen is a guy that a lot of people want to know about and will like to talk about. So we reached out to some Locked On hosts and got some intel from them. But now let's talk about guys that they might bring in. Who could the Commanders bring in on top of Deebo Samuel in the trade market? And you got to start that conversation with defensive end Myles Garrett, right? You can't have any of these conversations without talking about Myles. So let's talk about it. I mentioned to you guys, everybody, every day as you're going to remember this, ahead of the NFL Scouting Combine, I said the best thing for the Washington Commanders, which in turn would be the best thing for any NFL team, would be for the Cleveland Browns to dig in even deeper on the we're not trading Myles Garrett talk at the NFL Scouting Combine. Well, guess what? That's exactly what the Cleveland Browns did. They dug in incredibly deep. Well, shortly following that, Myles Garrett made it publicly known that he will not be playing for Cleveland and has zero interest to talk about a new contract or any additional contracts or extensions or negotiations. So the Cleveland Browns say, we're not interested in talking about trading for Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett said, I'm not interested in talking about playing for the Cleveland Browns. Somebody's going to blink. I don't know who it's going to be, but I got a feeling it's not going to be Myles Garrett. So no pettiness is happening. No unnecessary statements are being made. And that's, to me, is kind of the big thing in this conversation. If this was just about Myles Garrett getting more money from the Browns, you kind of feel like some of those things would be coming out, but they're not. This really kind of feels like a dude who's just trying to say, listen, it's over. Accept that it's over. Let's have a clean a break as possible. Let's just move on. But the Cleveland Browns don't want to do that. So I don't expect anything to come out of Myles Garrett trade talks before the NFL draft, to be completely honest with you. But life does come at you quick. Now, the reason I look at the trade or look at the draft weekend, right? You look at the A.J. Brown draft day trade from the Tennessee Titans to the Philadelphia Eagles, 2022 NFL draft. Tennessee Titans traded A.J. Brown to the Philadelphia Eagles for the number 18 pick and some other stuff. They end up drafting Treylon Burks, wide receiver out of Arkansas, who they thought was going to be their A.J. Brown replacement. Turns out not so much. Well, you look at that, if you want to kind of superimpose that situation on the Cleveland Browns, well, the Browns are currently at number 2. Reportedly, they want a quarterback, but reportedly the quarterback they want, at least according to Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus, is Cam Ward. It's not Shadir Sanders. It's not, oh, we'll take this guy if we don't get this guy. No, it's Cam Ward or basically nothing. So if the Titans don't go Cam Ward with the number 1 overall pick, then Cleveland is probably going to take him. If the Titans do go Cam Ward with the number 1 overall pick, then in that situation, you have a possibility where maybe the Cleveland Browns pull the trigger on, say, Abdul Carter out of Penn State, and they draft their edge replacement, and then they go shopping Myles Garrett, similar to the way that the Tennessee Titans did with A.J. Brown, only instead of trying to draft his replacement, they're looking to already draft his replacement. Now let's see what we can get for him to get up here and maybe get another quarterback, or maybe now you're willing to get Shedeur Sanders. If you can get, say, I don't know, if you can get the Jets first round pick off of them, if they're not interested in Shedeur, then you're willing to trade him, trade Myles Garrett and draft Shedeur because now you're using somebody else's first round pick, so to speak. However, if the Tennessee Titans if the Cleveland Browns do get Cam Ward at number 2, now they're in a very Tennessee Titans-esque situation where now we're looking to trade Myles Garrett for a pick in this year's draft that we're then going to turn and use on an edge rusher to try to replace Myles Garrett. Now, Georgia's Jalen Walker and Mykal Walker. Mykal Walker are projected to be top 10 picks. So if any of those teams wanted Garrett, they might be able to get Cleveland to come off of him. However, if Garrett isn't willing to sign a deal or even play for those teams, that may not come through. And if you're trading for Myles Garrett, you're going to want to know that he's not just going to pull, Hassan Reddick and say, no, I want out of here as well. Remember, he wants to win, right? So if you're a team that's not necessarily viewed as being ready to win now with a Myles Garrett may not be willing to come play for you. He doesn't have a no trade clause, right? But there are still certain things. Let's not pretend he's powerless in this situation, right? So that leaves teams in the 20s more likely destinations. And obviously the Washington Commanders at 29 are in that window. However, when you look at the options, right? Mike Green out of Marshall, Nick Scorton out of Texas A&M, James Pierce Jr. out of Tennessee are kind of the top 3 edge names that are projected to go in that area of the NFL draft. Could all be options, but teams like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Detroit Lions, who are both in the NFC, both have higher first-round picks than the Washington Commanders. They're also projected to be interested in another edge rusher. They might be willing to give up higher draft capital to get Myles Garrett and essentially price Washington out. So it's going to be an interesting situation there with the whole Myles Garrett situation. Not something, I was asked by an insider, how sure am I that the Washington Commanders could get Myles Garrett? I'd probably put it, honestly, at about a 50-50 proposition. I don't think it's a slam dunk, but I don't think it's a non-starter either. Now, is there another wide receiver that the Washington Commanders could target in a trade or a new league year starting type of deal? There are some options out there, and I've got some thoughts on them that I've been asked about. San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Brandon Aiyuk is a potential option. Former New York Jets receiver Devontae Adams, he was on here as a trade option potentially until he was released on Tuesday. Cooper Kupp, Los Angeles Rams has been part of the trade talk. Alan Lazard and the New York Jets also reportedly available unless he's been released by the time we're recording this as well. Look, I wouldn't hate adding Brandon Aiyuk. Like, I know it'd be kind of weird and maybe a little unorthodox to see the Washington Commanders add 2 former San Francisco 49ers wide receivers in the same offseason. But just as much as I was on board with the Washington Commanders bringing him in last year, I'm just as much on board as I am this year. And honestly, it's going to cost the Commanders less this year because of the injury that Brandon Aiyuk suffered last year. You know what I mean? Very serious knee injury. It's hard. Usually that first year back from that type of a knee injury is not a great year. So you're looking at that. Now, last year people were talking about like second round pick, maybe even a back end first round pick. Now, maybe you can give the 49ers John Allen, right? Like, it's not like the Niners, at least the reports weren't like the Niners were like, hell no to John Allen. We're not even willing to talk about him. Maybe they're willing to talk about it for Brandon Aiyuk, right? Jonathan Allen in conditional 4th in 2026. If Brandon Aiyuk hits certain markers, you give him a 3rd round pick. If he doesn't, it stays a 4th round pick. Right. I mean, it's just an interesting option to potentially talk about. You could end up with Deebo Samuel and Brandon Aiyuk for a 5th-round pick and a conditional 4th-round pick in 2026. That's not a bad deal for 2 very effective receivers, especially one coming off of an injury. So certainly would be interesting there. Now, from a pure talent standpoint, I would actually be in on Davante Adams, right? Like if this is Madden, go get Davante Adams, make him a free agent on your Madden game and go sign him, right? 85 catches, over 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns in 14 games last year for the Raiders and the Jets. Gross. The problem is this isn't Madden, and you got to deal with the personality. You got to deal with the man. The man has a reputation for being selfish, a reputation for being a diva, a reputation for preferring to have a great stat line and lose than have a low stat line and win. None of that fits into what the Washington Commanders are doing. Now, if he's learned from his previous mistakes, right? Because you got drafted the Green Bay Packers with a Hall of Fame quarterback. I'm not saying you didn't earn any of your accolades, certainly earned it, right? But it's like you walked into a very good situation for a wide receiver. You forced your way out of there to go play with your buddy Derek Carr in Las Vegas. That didn't go well. You forced your way out of Vegas to go play with your buddy Aaron Rodgers in New York. That didn't go any better. So instead of forcing your way out of somewhere, well, now you're free agent, but instead of following your buddies, maybe go play for the right situation instead of the quarterback that you have on your birthday card list, your Christmas card list, right? So if he's learned his lesson, maybe he's ready to follow along with a good team mentality instead of an individual mentality. Of course, you don't got to trade for him because he's been released, right? But outside of teams like Buffalo, Kansas City, Detroit, Baltimore, or Philly, if they trade A.J. Brown, which they reportedly took a call from the New England Patriots, but doesn't necessarily mean a trade is coming. But outside of those teams, there aren't any other teams that look like potential winners more than Washington, right? But the question would be, is Davante Adams going to try to come in here and now try to bully this young quarterback, Jaden Daniels, into giving him the ball more? Jaden Daniels is not going to be bullied, so he's not going to do it, and now you're just going to have a problem in the locker room. So Davante Adams has got to be coming into the situation with a very, very team-centric mentality, and the Commanders have got to make sure that that's what he's coming in with if they're going to go after it. But also, look, Buffalo is not going to deal with that diva attitude. Stephon Diggs found that out. Kansas City, certainly he's not going to be the top dog there. Detroit is not going to put up with it. The Baltimore Ravens are not going to put up with it. And the Philadelphia Eagles, look, if they want to put up with that, they'll just keep A.J. Brown because A.J. Brown is less of a diva than Davante Adams is. So, you know what I mean? It looks to me like Davante, your options are, if you're Davante Adams, continue to make bad career decisions and lose despite being one of the best receivers in the NFL, or realize that it's not all about you, yet if you make it all about the team, you will also then thrive. It's amazing how that works. Go join a team like any of these teams I just mentioned or the Washington Commanders and maybe go win a ring, man. You know what I mean? Maybe go get a ring to add to that Hall of Fame resume that you already have. I'm not high on Cooper Kupp, especially after the Deebo Samuel trade, nor am I interested in the team targeting Allen Lazard in a trade or in free agency, to be quite honest with you. So those are our thoughts on potential upcoming moves outside of a potential John Allen trade following the Deebo Samuel trade announcement. What are the Washington Commanders truly getting in Deebo Samuel? I gave you my thoughts when the trade was initially made. I'm going to dive deeper into the offensive fit with Cliff Kingsbury here later on the week. But now let's hear from Locked On 49ers hosts Brian Peacock and Eric Crocker on what they say the Commanders are getting in wide receiver Deebo Samuel when the new league year begins. That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Commanders, talking about what is next following the Deebo Samuel trade. We already talked about a good amount of that, but I also want to dive into what the Locked On 49ers host had to say about what the Washington Commanders are getting in Deebo in the first place. Is what comes next specifically is what version of Deebo Samuel they're getting. There's been a lot of questions about who he is as a player, as a teammate. Let's hear from Locked On 49ers host Brian Peacock and Eric Crocker, starting off with Eric Crocker about who they're getting in Deebo Samuel.
They're hoping that they get a motivated Deebo Samuel. And this is a guy clearly, has some issues. I did get word that, because a lot of people thought that it was the offseason where this, he requested the trade and all that. I've heard that he requested a trade prior to the trade deadline. So whatever his issues were with his team and the usage and all of that, like these are things that have been going on. I think he's a terrific football player, and I think he's locked in and he's in shape and all that. They're getting a really good guy that brings a different element to their offense. And with Jaden Daniels, his ability some of the things that, he's good at. I think just being able to get the ball in the hands of someone who's a playmaker, I think will help that offense. So, if I was a Commander fan, I'd be excited to get Deebo as long as he's in shape. Because if he's in shape, he's a handful to deal with.
What is the reason of Deebo not looking quite as explosive last year?
No, I think for them it's just like consistency and being able to use them in a consistent way. He did have like few big games last year, but then there's a 5-yard game, and then a 20-yard game, and a 20-yard game, and a 20-yard game. And there are way too many of those. We weren't used to seeing that from Deebo Samuel. So why the big difference? Like, why is it that you can go off for 100 yards and 100 yards or 90 yards and then have these games where you only have 5 yards? And I think that may have been part of the reason why he was a little disgruntled. Again, in my opinion, I don't know if he was in the best shape. They said he was heading into training camp, and at training camp, we definitely saw a terrific version of Deebo Samuel, but maybe after the pneumonia stuff, maybe, as he started to get a little, disgruntled, some other issues popped up.
Basically what Deebo Samuel is, again, for those Commanders fans that might be watching and, what to expect from him. Is it going to be somebody where the 49ers are like, oh, regret giving up Deebo Samuel? He is such a unique player, and he's kind of a one-of-a-kind player in the league because of how he plays, and he's not going to tear up man coverage. He's good against zone coverage, and I think he fits in well, kind of like he did with Brandon Aiyuk in a 1-2 role. He fits in similarly well with Terry McLaurin in Washington, I think, who can be more of a man beater, can give you some stuff down the field, and Deebo can do a lot of work against zone, and you give him short stuff, let him run, move him around, use him in the backfield, and do all of those things, and some run after the catch. Even the diminished version of Deebo Samuel is a very useful and very unique player, and still potentially a dynamic kick return man. I think you got to use him as a kickoff returner.
All right, that was Locked On 49ers host Eric Crocker and Brian Peacock talking about Deebo Samuel, who the Washington Commanders are set to acquire at the beginning of the new league year in exchange for a 5th-round pick. We assume 2025 5th-round pick. That is going to wrap up today's episode. On our next episode, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the Deebo Samuel fit in the Cliff Kingsbury offense, but it's also mailbag day. So we got a lot of mailbag questions from our insiders. If you have further mailbag questions, don't hesitate to send them in. I will send you a text on Wednesday to solicit more either way if you don't want to do that on your own. In the meantime, if you out there have questions or comments, or you want to get in on the mailbag discussions and you're not already, become a Locked On Commanders insider at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. I want to thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day today and every day. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get all the latest draft buzz, especially coming out of the NFL Scouting Combine. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you are listening to this podcast. As always, thank you so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day. Everydayers, thank you for coming through every stinking day. Until we speak again, if you're on about, please be safe, be kind, and I will see you right back here next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.